to change the prominence level of the elements. That is, we have to differentiate prominent elements from less prominent ones in order to be understood. And the aim of this talk is to look at the prosody meaning relation in prominence marking, both from a production and a perception point of view, and to shed at least some light on the many factors that play a role in this communicative process. Elements in an utterance may stand out for different reasons. So the red pencil here, which you hopefully see, may have a particular prominence cueing property, while another pencil may stand out for a different reason. And let's just start very basically by having a closer look at some potential cues to prominence. And I have to say that as a caveat that I will only consider West Germanic languages today. So first of all, there are a couple of lexical properties that play a role. In the sentence here, Mary invited her neighbor to a party. The blue words are more prominent because they are content words, which have been found to be more prominent than function words. Words also differ in semantic weight, with semantically heavy words standing out. Low frequency words have been judged to be more prominent than high frequency words. And animate concepts are claimed to be more prominent than inanimate ones. When looking at discourse properties in the second sentence here, she even invited John to the party. John is standing out for several different reasons. So he's in focus, which is narrow focus, plus marked by the focus particle even. John is also referentially and lexically new. It's a direct object and fulfills the semantic role of patient, which has been suggested to be more prominent than the agent role, in the sense of standing out. I will come back to this point in a second. In this sentence, it is John she invited to the party. John is made prominent by clefting, that is a specific word order construction. And other morphosyntactic prominence cues are focus markers and indefinite articles. And of course, I mean, the most important thing for us here today, and for me in particular, is that the different elements are also made prosodically prominent, of course, which has an important impact on the meaning conveyed. So there's the assumption that the position of the final, the nuclear accent, is decisive for the correct pragmatic interpretation of an utterance. And that can be nicely shown, I think, by an example by Beaver and Clark. So in this first sentence, and I hope you can hear this now.
You have to unmute your laptop again.
Okay. You know what I have to do?
David only wears a bow tie when teaching.
You hear that? Okay, that's unfortunate. I should put on the audio here again. Okay, then in this case, I just have to produce it myself. Yeah, Ollie, should I do it?
Can you ask the for the online people whether they can hear what you are saying?
Yeah. So the Zoom people, do you hear anything when I play this? I see Gilbert, for example. Gilbert, can you nod or?
We heard. Now we don't hear it. We heard something before with echo once, but not now anymore.
If they can hear it, maybe I pronounce it for you, for the on-site people. So that should be David only wears a bow tie when teaching, which means that teaching is the only situation in which David wears a bow tie. And the second sentence has quite a different meaning. I play this to the Zoom people.
Oh, we can't hear it. We can't hear it
Oh,
either.
you can't.
No, we heard it once before, but then not anymore.
You heard it before, okay.
Yeah, one time.
David only wears a bow tie when teaching.
Did you hear that?
Now we can hear it, but there's some strange echo sometimes a little bit. So.
Right. Okay, now this is off. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So this sentence should sound something like, David only wears a bow tie when teaching. And this suggests, at least that's the most obvious reading for me, that David wears nothing but a bow tie while he's teaching. So nuclear accents are commonly more prominent than pre-nuclear ones, and rising and high accents have been found to sound more prominent than falling or low accents. Furthermore, phrasing or phrase boundaries also have a prominent skewing function at times in that they promote the accent before the boundary to a nuclear accent. And prominence is expressed by gradient phonetic cues such as duration, F0 movement, or periodic energy. Okay, as an intermediate summary, we can say prominence cueing signal-based means of highlighting are prosodic and syntactic in nature. So we can call this the formal side of an expression. And on the other hand, factors that are based on our contextual expectations and knowledge about the world and the language are semantic pragmatic in nature. And some elements are more important and or unpredictable than others. And I'd like to call these elements informative. So that's a term already used by Bollinger and Ladd in the 70s and 80s. So somewhat simplistically, this is the meaning side of an expression. So what's the relation between prosodic highlighting and informativeness? That's our question. And although both levels should have an independent impact on prominence production and perception, the plausible assumption would be that there is a direct correspondence between the two. That is, the more informative an item is, the more prominent it is made prosodically. And I will not say much about the syntactic means today. Okay, this assumption is in line with and very closely related to previous studies that approached this relationship from a different perspective by saying that prosodic prominence is inversely related to linguistic predictability and lack of importance, and which has also often been called discourse prominence. For example, surprisal in information theory, or you may be quite familiar with the smooth signal redundancy hypothesis by Eilert and Turk, claiming that a strong relationship between acoustic prominence, and they basically looked at duration differences, and the level of language redundancy, which is the same as semantic pragmatic predictability. And this leads to utterances whose elements have similar probabilities of recognition, and they call this the smooth signal redundancy profile. And there's a more recent study by Rory Turnbull, among others probably, showing that phonetic prominence in terms of pitch height is more or less inversely related to linguistic predictability. Okay, but if we think of this relation in a parallel or positively correlated fashion, we can ask the basic question, so that's the title of the talk, are highlighted words always informative, and vice versa? The clearest positive answer to this question would have probably been given by Dwight Bollinger, who promoted what he called, well, and what we will call today, the highlighting view. It's based on functionalist approaches by Danesh and other Prague School people, and also Halliday and Schaaf, which is strictly pragmatic in nature. And it's claimed that the relation between communicative importance and accent is bidirectional and universal, and that accentuation is gradual and depends mainly on the intentions of the speaker, So it's basically unpredictable. And also on the discourse context. So Bob Ladd called this in the first edition of his international phonology book, a radical focus to accent approach. One type of counter evidence to a strict highlighting view are cases of focus without accent, and such as focus projection. In focus projection, accents do not mark single words, but structurally important so-called focus exponents of larger constituents, which contain several informative elements, as in a broad focus sentence like, "What's up? I'm going to Denmark tomorrow." So we just have an accent on Denmark, which is the focus exponent of this broad focus sentence or utterance, but not every word is accented. So a very strict focus to accent approach should have an accent on, lead to an accent on every single word. And the position of an accent is to some extent predictable by syntactic rules of a language. In English and German, for example, we know that arguments as obligatory verbal complements are more likely to receive pitch accent than predicates if they occur in the same focus domain. Focus projection rules are widely accepted, but also is the idea that pitch accents mark informativeness, so in West Germanic languages at least, again, and that specific pitch accent types are particularly appropriate markers of certain levels of informativeness, such as topic, focus, or contrastive focus. P. Humbert and Hirschberg for American English attributed general meanings to accent types as to their information status, but also to focus. And they claimed that given items often carry a low accent or are de-accented, accessible ones are downstepped or have a mid-tone, new items carry high or slightly rising accents, and contrastive accents are sharply rising. And note that the perceived prominence, prosodic prominence of the accent types increases from left to right, which is in line with the highlighting view, actually. So more informative elements are more prominent. So several studies have shown that such a relation generally exists, but that it is probabilistic in nature. There's, for example, a study by Mücke and Grice, 2014, and they found more downstepped accents in broad focus. As you can see here, the high plus downstep high star, and more rising accents in narrow and contrastive focus, which means more prominent accent types mark pragmatically more important or more narrowly focused elements, but not in a one-to-one, but rather in a many-to-many relation, so that we can call it at least some support, since the relation is far from being random, but rather weak support of the highlighting view. And a note on categoriality and gradients. And we just accounted for the form-meaning relation in terms of the probabilistic distribution of accent types by measuring percentages. Following Ladd, this approach employs what he calls statistical gradients. But this level of phonetic gradients, or the level of phonetic gradients, I should highlight, or physical gradients, as called by Bob Ladd, is accounted by a distributional approach proposed by Kangemi and Grice, reflecting the importance of how the various phonetic parameters are distributed within a phonological category. And it's claimed that a model of intonation requires such a third dimension, namely substance, that relates equally to both form and meaning. A recent perception study on the relation between prosodic prominence and meaning that takes the influence of the situational context into account is the one by Cole and Röttger, 2020. they challenged the conventional view of pitch, accent, meaning, which is based on Pierre Humbert and Hirschberg, as I just showed you. Since empirical evidence for accent type meaning relations are not clear-cut, as we just saw by Mücker and Grice. Instead, they propose what they call the informativity hypothesis, which means that pitch, accent, meaning derives from a direct association between intonational prominence and informativity, which they define in terms of unpredictability and importance. And in their study, participants received 3 types of gems from a gumball machine, which either varied in frequency, which they relate to unpredictability. So here, for example, in the picture, the yellow topaz is least predictable because it's least frequent. And the other type is predictability. Is the point value, which they relate to importance. So they get different kinds of, a different number of points for each gem. And now the setup is as follows. Some of the participants only heard a recorded sentence displaying 3 different contours with a low, falling, or rising pitch accent on the word thingy. They have to say, ah, now I've got a thingy. And they had to guess the gem they received only based on the prominence of the contour. And probably, since you can't, or should I try it again, Ollie? No, doesn't make any sense. So I produce it. I hope this is, maybe Jennifer will set this straight afterwards. So it's something, the low tone, now I've got a thingy. Now I've got a thingy. Something like that, quite monotonous. The falling tone is, now I've got a thingy. And the rise fall is, now I've got a thingy. And the hypothesis by Cole and Röttger was confirmed that listeners interpret intonational prominence relative to predictability and importance in a specific situational context, and not necessarily to information structural categories like focus and givenness, which we usually investigate in such production studies. And as an example, a more prominent or rising pitch accent here on the right side is associated with less predictable and more important information, whereas a less prominent or low-pitched pitch accent on the left side is associated with lower importance. Here we have the importance, lower importance, and higher predictability. And so the results are in favor of a differentiated highlighting view, I would say, in that informativeness operates along various contextually specified meaning dimensions, which, as I said, are not necessarily always focus and givenness. The fact that contextual expectations are a very important factor in prominence perception could also be shown in a little older but still very cool study by Jason Bishop, 2012, who asked his participants to judge the prominence level of the words, while the target stimulus, and that's really important, it's exactly the same in all conditions. So I play you a sentence focus example and an object focus, which means broad focus versus narrow. No, I can't play it to you. I tried again, but
Stefan, what is if you simply if you take this one out and you just hold the microphone to the loudspeaker?
That's a good idea. Yeah.
Play.
Yeah.
Right. Perhaps this works.
Then I have to.
Where comes the feedback from?
No idea.
Turn the mic of your computer, just the mic, not mute yourself in Zoom.
It is off.
No, but Oh, yes, right. This one is on. Are you sure that your Zoom is off? That your Zoom microphone? Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now everything is off. Yeah.
If I mute this one, no, this doesn't work. I'm sorry.
If I make.
Let's try it again.
Sorry.
Play it now. Yeah, wait. They're going to go.
Okay, the box is.
Hmm?
Content menu very little.
Yeah.
Oh.
So,
So the sentence focuses: why is your wife mad? Because your roof's leaking? The answer: no, because I bought a boat. Because I bought a motorcycle. Object focus: why is your wife mad? Because you bought a car? No, because I bought a motorcycle. So exactly the same answer. And as a result, for the object noun, so the noun motorcycle, object focus was judged as more prominent than sentence focus. So although it was exactly the same stimulus. And what we can learn from this is that the interpretation of prominence is not to the interpretation of the utterance, as we heard before. So let's now have a closer look at prenuclear accents. Since their structural and functional status is less clear, it's an interesting question, I think. So in fact, it has been shown that they yield a lower intertranscriber agreement than nuclear accents, and that listeners are not very sensitive to prenuclear accents, which may surface as longer reaction times in accent recognition tasks. And consequently, prenuclear accents were also judged as prominent to a much lower extent than nuclear accents. So in line with this unclear status of prenuclear accents, Bühring suggested that they are only ornamental, as he calls it, in nature, especially if they occur on prefocal elements. As in this example here, who did Gus vote for? Gus voted for a friend of his neighbors from Littleville. So Bühring claims that accents on the subject Gus, as well as the verb voted, are possible, but not obligatory. And along similar lines, it has been suggested, for example, by Sascha Kalun, that prenuclear accents are used due to a general principle of rhythmic organization, and that they do not reliably mark meaning distinctions. And this question actually was the starting point for thinking about a parallel test paradigm for American English and German, which our group in Cologne developed together with Jennifer Cole and Eleanor Shodroff at Northwestern University, and now also University of York, because Eleanor is in York now. And we tried to answer the question, are prenuclear accents merely ornamental, or do they systematically reflect aspects of informativeness in their phonological or phonetic prominence? Or in other words, does the highlighting view apply to prenuclear accents as well? Actually, there are some, but few previous studies on German, actually, by Bettina Braun, 2006, and Kirian Kübler, 2008, which suggested some systematic effects and that peak scaling and alignment in prenuclear accents actually do reflect some meaning differences. Subtle, but there is some reflection of meaning. So we set up a structurally very similar production experiment for both languages, for American English and German, and elicited read speech in 2 different speaking styles, so neutral and lively. Each story consists of 3 sentences. Context 1 introduces the setting. In the 3rd sentence, either given, accessible, new, or contrastive. And finally, we have the target sentence with the target words we're interested in. An example target sentence is the nun watered an almond tree in the English translation. Die Nonne gießt ein Mandelbaum. We have several versions of this sentence on the next slide. And nun is the target word. So this is the sentence initial noun is what we're looking at more closely. So let's go through an example story with the 4 conditions. Here, the first context sentence sets the scene. After the long winter, everybody was looking forward to a couple of sunny hours in the open. The second one, the nun was looking after the cloister garden, makes in this condition the target word textually given, right? Nun is repeated, since the target sentence is the nun watered an almond tree. So we would expect here that we find de-accentuation of nun. That would be most appropriate, we thought. In the second condition, the nun is made accessible due to the cloister garden scenario. So we would expect here that a low accent on nun would be most appropriate. In the new condition, the target word is not derivable from the context. Context sentence is the sun had been shining all day and the snow had finally melted. So nothing that we can derive the nun from. Again, we would expect an accent on nun, but this time a higher one, a bit more prominent than in the accessible condition. And finally, the contrastive condition elicits a double focus between the monk and the nun. So the monk watered a blackberry bush, the nun watered an almond tree. So the nun is hypothesized to be most prominent here, so that the rising accent seems to be appropriate. But now, what actually happened? So the most relevant results in a nutshell. Some of the results are in favor of the highlighting view. For example, in terms of duration. So increased informativeness corresponds to longer durations with a clearer picture in American English. You can see here quite nicely that actually per accent type that you have an increase from given via accessible new to contrastive. So the duration gets longer. Some results are in favor of the highlighting view, but are more language specific. In American English, we found a larger number of high prominence accents, that is low plus high star, on more informative items, that is contrastive topics, and vice versa. So lower prominence accents. So yeah, the non-contrastive items get the lower prominence accents. And we found a compressed pitch range marking givenness in the English dataset. Counter evidence for the highlighting view is the general finding that we have consistent accentuation on the target words in both languages.
We have lost the sound online.
Could you say something?
Yeah, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now we can, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, as I said, one result was particularly interesting and surprising, and that is that many contrastive target words were produced as least prominently, especially in German. For example, this was shown by lower values of F0 slope, as you can see in this figure here. Actually, there's a double contrast in this condition, resulting in a flat head pattern in many cases. That is, we have a pre-nuclear rise followed by a plateau and a nuclear fall, in which both the pre-nuclear and the nuclear accents are marked as prosodically rather non-prominent. So we have an example here with the second sentence called, or sounds probably something like, der Rabbi hat ein Dromedar verkauft. Der Rabbi hat ein Dromedar verkauft. Which sounds, yeah, not particularly prominent. If you imagine that the pre-nuclear accent should be or is contrastive in nature. So the reason for this relative lack of prosodic prominence might be that the contrast is already expressed by the parallel syntactic structure, and as this in the same time is also a parallel semantic pragmatic structure. Actually. That is, speakers just do not have to put a particularly strong accent on the contrasted item, as we saw actually in the English data, since another component of the linguistic system, that is syntax here, takes over, which achieves the same function. So these results support the view of a somewhat stable rhythmical frame for American English and German. That is, we have two predestined positions for prosodic prominence, one near the beginning and one near the end. That's what has been called by Dwight Bollinger already in the 60s. And this might be a stronger structural cue than the packaging of a reference informativeness. In any case, we can say, as a little conclusion of the comparative study here, that prosody only weakly encodes informativeness in pre-nuclear accents in the two languages, and only to a relatively small degree. But nevertheless, we found that American English shows a more robust association between pre-nuclear prominence and informativeness than German, at both levels of phonological categories and phonetic gradients. Although American English and German generally have a similar prosodic system, I think we can agree on that, but this turned out to be less similar than expected. It was quite an interesting result. Right, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the idea of the rhythmical frame. It triggers the question of the relation between or the relativity of prominences in the same intonation unit. I think Frank asked a question yesterday about this. And also by which aspects these are influenced. And we are currently analyzing a study on German in which we tested the joint influence of meaning-related and form-related factors on the prominence relation between two pitch accents, looking at both paradigmatic and syntagmatic effects. So this is an example of the stimuli for our production experiments with picture cards and accompanying sentences. And the target sentences, which were always the third one, contain two target words, an indirect object followed by a direct object. And these were either new or accessible in the discourse context. Accessible objects were cued through the context provided by this in the second sentence and the picture. Here, for example, we have a construction site, and this marks the activates the painter. At least that's the idea. And yeah, I would love to play you an example here, but I can produce it. Unter anderem hat sie dem Maler eine Waage verkauft. And yeah, I play it again. Unter anderem hat sie dem Maler eine Waage verkauft. This was a common way of putting it. And this is why you would have heard that in this example, because of examples like this, we rather talk about medial and final accents, because we very often got a phrase break after the first target word. So the Maler, eine Waage verkauft. So in roughly 40% of the utterances, we had such a phrase boundary between the two target words, so that both accents actually became nuclear. We would have loved to have pre-nuclear nuclear accents, but most of the time we have two nuclear accents. But still, the relation between the two accents in the sentence is really interesting, and this is what we're looking for. So we collected our data in an interactive task via Zoom, in which we asked our subjects to read a story in such a way that a fellow player, actually there was a confederate, is able to remember the story and to sort picture cards in the right order, as you can see here on the right-hand side. The results show that, first of all, new reference are generally marked by more prominent accent types than accessible reference, both in medial and final position, which is wonderful and which is in line with the highlighting hypothesis, or with the highlighting view. Second, we found a syntagmatic effect. So the first one was a paradigmatic effect, right? In both positions, we find an effect of informativeness. So new, more prominent than accessible information. So second, we find a syntagmatic effect of information status on the second object. The final pitch accent is marked most prominently, and we say that because, or due to the fact that we have a higher percentage of the very prominent accent type low plus high star. So when the referent is newer, we find this. When the referent is newer than a preceding referent, and it is marked least prominent in this column, when it is more accessible than a preceding referent. And third, we find, again, a syntagmatic effect, but this time not of informativeness, but of the tonal context. So the type of medial accent determines the relation between accent type and information status in the final accent. It's a bit complicated. So the effect is weaker after low plus high star accents in the left column. See that there's not a big difference between accessible and new information in terms of marking. And it is stronger after low star high accents as a medium pitch accent. So we find only very few rising accents on accessible reference, as you can see here. And this is probably because the rise of the preceding low star plus high occurs later than in L plus H star, which makes it easier to produce a head pattern, which in turn is particularly appropriate as a marker of accessible information. This is why we find more or just less prominent accents on accessible information. So, but what's important here, we have a syntagmatic effect of the tonal context. Okay, to sum up, our preliminary results show effects of both information status and tonal context on prosodic prominence relations. And quite interestingly, they show some similarity with data from a recent production study by Simon Rössig, eliciting different focus structures in an interactive task. And these, what you can see here, are time and pitch normalized average contours of broad on the left, narrow in the middle, and contrastive focus structures, each including 2 accents on discourse reference in equivalent utterances. And these data are so exciting, I think, because we can observe some balancing between the prominence level of the pitch accents realized on the first and the second target word. So depending on the focus structure, the more prominently the second accent is produced, as you can see here it's not very prominent, narrow rising, contrast, more rising, the less prominent the first one becomes, right? You have a look at the prenuclear accents. So, and the preliminary results of the card sorting experiment that I just showed you suggest a very similar structure. Actually, so these are the same data. This is just the expected data for our new study, in analogy to the focus data by Simon. And so the prominence relations seem to change according to the respective information status levels. The newer, the more prominent, but depending on the level of informativeness of the surrounding items. And all this gives rise to the idea of a somewhat fixed prominence budget, both in terms of prosodic prominence and informativeness, which is distributed across pitch accents within an utterance. Thus, modulations of a specific distribution of prominences may reflect changes in both meaning-related, such as information status, and form-related, such as accent type. And this happens jointly and at the same time. At least that's a hypothesis. And these ideas are very much in line with a distributional approach to intonation, aiming to integrate phonetic gradients and phonological categories into the study of prominence. And one way of representing both qualitative and quantitative levels of prominence cues are attractor landscapes as a type of dynamical system, which are modulated by a set of control parameters. Attractors are stable states on a continuous dimension in the system, and as such reflect categories. And as you can see in the example figure, it may be possible, for example, to have a joint control parameter, like information status in our study, that can modulate an attractor landscape for multiple accents in a single utterance, which mirrors the probability of a value for a specific cue. So the change of probability is reflected in the red curve here. However, a big difficulty for any kind of prominence model is the multiplicity of relevant cues. We already mentioned several times during this conference and also in the beginning of this talk. And I go a little bit back in time now because in order to get an idea of which are the most important factors for German, we conducted a rapid prosody transcription task some years ago. This task was briefly explained by Amalia yesterday, by the way. And in our study, 28 untrained listeners were asked to underline the words they perceived as prominent in a set of 60 read German sentences, which were taken from various databases with different focus structures, information status categories, and also different pitch accent types, which were based on a consensus transcription by experts. And in the instruction, we deliberately left open which reading of prominence listeners should adapt by saying your task is now to underline all words on the transcript which you perceive as stressed, highlighted, or important, which is again, by the way, very similar to what Amalia's study was about. She mentioned yesterday. So we tested 3 classes of variables: gradient, prosodic ones, like a zero range, spectral tilt, duration, discrete prominence, discrete prosodic variables like accent position or accent type, and non-prosodic variables like part of speech, word frequency, and so on. And a confirmatory analysis revealed that each variable had an influence on prominence perception in the expected direction. So we have really a vast amount of different variables that do have an influence on prominence perceptions. In the second step, we wanted to know which of these variables are more important than others. And for that, we conducted an exploratory random forest analysis, which is a data mining algorithm that uses all variables to predict prominence. And using the p-score as a dependent variable, which is the proportion of the participants that underscored a word as prominent. We found that the discrete prosodic variables, including pitch, accent, type, and position, are strongest determinants of prominence, but gradient, prosodic, and also non-prosodic cues, for example, word frequency, play a role to some extent as well. In a third step of the study, we investigated whether there were systematic individual differences between listeners in the weighting of these factors. We did this in an exploratory cluster analysis. And we found that variability between listeners is high, but not random. So since they broadly fall into two groups of clusters, you see here the positive values show a more relevant variable for a specific cluster, and negative values show less relevant variables, right? And we found that one group relied more on prosodic factors, which we call pitch-guided listeners. You can see here, so this is the white bars. They may have interpreted the task as looking for highlighted words. And a second cluster, second group, relied obviously more on lexical and syntactic cues. This is why we call them lexical syntactic listeners. Or they interpreted the task to a larger extent and looking for informative words. Still, our RPT study showed that different listeners just pay attention to different cues. And this is why it's important that a multiplicity of cues is available, so that one potential cue can serve as a backup for another one. And the fact that all 17 variables tested were associated with perceived prominence suggests that prominence is indeed signaled by multiple factors simultaneously, which is a finding that has also been stated by previous studies. In fact, prominence marking turns out to be a functionally redundant system, which makes use of linguistically diverse cues in order to assure robust transmission via speech. And this term, functional redundancy, is used by Kitano, 2004, is also known as degeneracy, which is a technical term used in computational biology to describe cases in which multiple, and that's really important, different system components achieve the same function. So it's not just redundant, meaning it doesn't matter, but there have to be different diverse cues that have the same function. And we saw this in our pre-nuclear accent data, right? When contrastive topics were marked by syntax rather than prosody. So one function was standing in for another one. Okay, conclusions. In order to conclude, let's go back to our overarching question. Are highlighted words always informative and vice versa? Which we also call the highlighting rule. And although your first reaction probably was of course not, I mean, that's way too simplistic, there still is some evidence that the highlighting view actually is a basic principle of the relation between prosodic prominence and informativeness, at least in West Germanic languages. Nevertheless, of course, this relationship is definitely much more complex. Even when we compare German and English, which turned out to be far less similar than expected in our joint experiment on pre-nuclear accents. So first of all, there are many, many different prominence markers to choose from. And these are not only prosodic in nature, of course. Secondly, several kinds of expectations influence the actual markings. So we have expectations of both speakers and listeners pertaining to rhythmical structure, information structure, or to a more specific situational context, as in Jennifer's and Timo's study. Furthermore, we showed that prominences influence each other at a syntagmatic level. That is, they have to be viewed in relation to one another. And we also find variability at many different levels. It's, also Maria Paula's talk yesterday mentioned a lot of, said a lot about variability at these different levels. And this blurs a direct mapping between prosodic prominence and informativeness. So there's statistical gradients in the shape of probabilistic distributions of categories. There's physical gradients in continuous phonetic parameters, as well as speaker and listener specific differences. And despite all this diversity at various levels, prominence marking in production and perception turns out to be a communicatively robust system due to what we called, or what Gaetano called, functional redundancy of these cues. And that's about it. I just have one more slide, and this is to thank these great people who contributed to the research I just presented in many different and very important ways. So thanks to them, and thanks to you for listening.
Put it on here.
It is on.
It is on, okay. Yes, is it on? Yeah, you can hear. Okay, but many thanks to Stefan Baumann for a very fine and inspiring lecture, also complicated, and you won over some of these difficulties that were there. So in fact, it is 3 o'clock now, but we agree here that of course we shall have a discussion of it, and then we'll take it. So I declare the discussion. Okay, I couldn't see that, but you can see that, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. Good. Okay, so please, Amalia. Amalia, please, could you put your question?
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talk, despite all the technical issues we had today. I don't know if you can hear me.
Could you speak a little louder, please?
Louder?
Somebody in this room perhaps not muted could be on. Was it work the whole 2 days?
Can you hear me or?
Yes, it's fine now. Amalia, please. Yes, it's fine.
Thank you. So the issue I have a couple of questions, and I wanted to know what your thoughts are about those. You said that some things are more, this accent was, you expected, for example, informativeness and the fall of the F0 to go hand in hand, and you were rather surprised. And this kind of suggests that the expectation is that there is a straightforward relationship between acoustic parameters and how prominent an item is in discourse. But isn't there any room for phonology in there, which may dictate that, you know, certain things will be less prominent, but it's from an objective perspective, but not necessarily from the perspective of the listener who is familiar with the specific linguistic system? And a related question is, if we have multiple cues and some listeners, like your listeners and the ones in my study, attend to different cues, how do we communicate? Because can these cues lead to us thinking of different words as being more prominent and therefore more informative?
I'm not sure whether I understood auditorily your questions.
Well, yeah, sorry. So the basic, this direct connection between prosodic prominence and informativeness is, of course, a model that I try to just to see whether it holds, or to what extent it holds, right? So your first question was about the phonology, right? Or what,
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I think that we have a probabilistic distribution of pitch accents is part of an answer to that. Of course, I mean, former suggestions of a focus accent or a topic accent just turned out to be not appropriate, right? We know that we have a choice of different accent types, and within these accent types, phonetic gradient differences. So this interesting study by Martin and colleagues showed or found that one speaker actually produced H-star accents for all different kinds of focus structures, but the tonal alignment within this high star was significantly different in the expected direction. So that's just, speakers and also listeners just have a vast amount of different possibilities to mark their intended function. Right?
Okay.
I don't know if this answered your concrete question, or
we can talk about it later.
Yes.
I don't want to, because there are people waiting. So
yeah.
Okay, we can talk later.
Yes, thank you. We have three more raised hands at the moment here, and later we'll take those first. That was Jennifer Cole was first, so please.
Yeah. Thank you, Stefan. That was really interesting, and I was particularly taken by your recent findings about the syntagmatic context. And so my question is whether you have begun yet to look at the effect of the following edge tones for words in nuclear position in relation to their informativeness. And I was wondering whether you have found or would be expecting to find syntagmatic relationships there as well.
We looked at them, and actually we controlled the data in this respect, that we only got final boundary tones actually. So these were all declarative sentences, and we made people repeat the sentences when they produced continuation rises. So we controlled for that by saying that we had a technical problem. I mean, we see today that it happened so many times that wasn't a problem for them to tell them via Zoom, we had some problems, please do it again. So no, we controlled for the boundary tones.
Yes, thank you. And the next raised hand was from Gilbert and Brasatis. So please.
Thank you, Stefan. This was...
I pronounced it perhaps incorrectly, but please.
It's all right. I don't know how my name is pronounced either. Thank you, Stefan. That was very inspiring in many ways. I'm interested in this idea of this prominence budget. and I'm wondering if you're aware of any study that has tried to test this perceptually. So I was wondering if you would do like a classical perceptual rating task, where you asked participants to rate every word in the sentence using a somehow fine-grained scale. Then the idea could, I mean, it could be this prominence budget might then predict that an individual listener would usually use the same amount of prominence for a sentence. So if you vary then sentence and make it longer, add a few words, or change the information structure, then the individual ratings would vary, but the sum of the ratings would be the same for given a particular rater. Are you aware of any such studies, or do you think this would be an idea to test?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any of these studies, so maybe the community can say something about that, or guide us to if there's something like that. But actually, that's what we're planning to do with our data. But first, we have to collect the production data and then get some appropriate target stimuli, or maybe we could also, of course, control them. That the budget in our stimuli are actually equal or balanced in a way that what we want to test, and then we're planning to do a perception experiment on that. Exactly, more or less what you just described. But that's yeah, will take a while.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. And the last raised hand from the online here, that was by Pilar Prieto. So please.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. You're just so loud that we all can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much, Stefan, for the talk. I had a question about the potential differences in your results for the experiment with red speech that didn't look like, at least for German, right? That had some prominence related marking of levels of information structure, and then the results of the other experiment that really showed.
Which experiment do you refer to now?
The first, what I think was with red speech. I was thinking that perhaps it was an effect of red speech. That was my thinking.
Yes.
So I don't know. I wanted to see what you think about these elicitation methods that we could
definitely
follow, and
could be, and it's so strictly controlled, especially because we wanted to have exactly the same structure for American English, which was a huge task in itself. But yes, I agree that maybe we find for German these incredible amount, nearly 100% accents on the prenuclear or on first on the subject, so on the first noun. That this also is very typical for reading intonation in German. I agree. So we would have to check to see if we look at completely or really spontaneous data, if we find the same. But it is not uncommon to have a prominence at the beginning of an utterance. So what I said, that we have these two predestined positions, which already was claimed by Bollinger.
Right.
This is very, so this idea of the rhythmical frame makes total sense, I think, at least for German, it seems.
Thank you.
Okay, and I've seen two more raised hands here on site. So the first one was you. Yeah. No. She was first. Yeah. 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 You have to unmute. Bettina, you have to unmute your.
To be unmuted. Thank you. So thank you for a really wonderful talk. I also love this idea with the syntagmatic relations, so looking into one intonational phrase. But I was particularly drawn to this fixed prominence budget, and assuming that we can kind of measure that in a reliable and valid way, these kind of prominences across the utterances. So what you showed there was average contours across all the speakers. Yes. So my question would be, do you find the same, like a fixed prominence budget on each utterance? And would you assume that it scales up to longer utterances, like having 3 accents or 3 small IPs or something like that?
Yeah, we so far only had a look at, or closer, we analyzed only 10 speakers out of 32, actually. So, but the idea from Simon's, so Simon Rössig's data, we took over because it looked so similar, and I don't know how many subjects or how many sentences Simon analyzed, but these data look really compelling, right? So first of all, we have to see, after having analyzed these 32 people, whether it really looks the same. And then having 3 different or 3 accents or more in an utterance would be, again, another step. Maybe after the perception study, actually, with 2 accents. But yeah, probably maybe 2 accents in one utterance is quite a good number. It probably, probably, I mean, it would be just interesting to see whether this idea also holds with more prominences, and maybe also not just clear pitch accents, but also secondary prominences. But this is, we should talk about this in 10 years, probably. I don't know. But first of all, we try to get some evidence for this idea of this prominence budget. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, and I think we have 2 more.
Thanks, that was great. I just had 2 observations for comment, really. Probably things you've thought of yourself as well. So firstly, with you had this interesting statistical separation between sort of 2 rough groups of speakers, of listeners in terms of strategy, and whether you've thought of looking at these in terms of production and whether these 2 map onto each other. So if you've got different strategic approaches in production which parallel the way people do it in perception, that might be worth considering. And the other thing was, it's very striking to see this real hyper redundancy in production of prominence cues, and that immediately makes me think of sort of Lindblom and H&H theory, and the degree to which this is a feature of this read speech style, potentially a sort of hyper-articulated citation form, and the degree to which you'll see modulation and maybe less redundancy and sort of focus on specific cues, maybe more cue trading in more high pressure speech styles, more naturalistic styles under different sorts of conditions.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a comment, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, feel free to say
no. No, I don't have to say much to that. It sounds great. Yeah, we can't directly take the so the RPT data. We just have in that form. So these are perception data, and we. I mean, of course, we chose the actual produced data according to some. So we had a pre-selection, especially in terms of accent types, because the first idea was to find some evidence for secondary prominences, actually. So I made a selection of this that they have the same amount of different pitch accent types, but also post-nuclear prominences. And I was hoping to find some evidence that it's really in a rapid prosody transcription task, more or less in the middle between no prominence markings and a lot of prominence markings, like for a fully fledged pitch accent. But this is not what I found, actually. Yeah, I think we should discuss this later. Thanks.
Yeah. In fact, the last hand was dropped here on the screen. So I think we can conclude. And first of all, of course, a warm thanks for a great keynote speech to Stefan. And then also, yeah. And also thanks to the discussants.
Yeah, thank you.
But then I can just quickly add to that we have a 15 minutes delay, but I think we should take this delay also into the next session. So we basically just continue with everything 15 minutes later. That means that we can now go into the virtual poster session, and that we do not session, and then we hopefully see you soon. Okay.